I thought it might be interesting to people that are interested in cacti in general, how we study them and some of the ways that they are using various processes to evolve in different regions. But I'm going to be focusing on Baja California specifically, and of course, the cholla cacti from my dissertation work. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So Baja California, just to give you an idea of the region for those who don't know it, and if you don't know it, shame on you, it's an amazing part of the world. But we just kind of finished an annotated checklist of there. We have about 4,000 different plants in the region. And it's made up of two different states, the northern state, the southern state. Right now, the northern state's a little bit more diverse than the southern. But I think one of the unique parts of the peninsula, what really makes it unique, and that is that I'm not using that word lightly, is endemism. And those are plants that are restricted to the Baja California region. And if you look at the numbers there, it's about 900. Almost 26% of the flora is only found in the Baja California Peninsula and its adjacent islands. So endemism is quite high there. And if you look at the flora in general, just as one would expect from any part of at least North America, Asteraceae, which are the composites, the sunflower family, the grass family, the Poaceae, and the legume family are the three dominant families. But if you go down just a couple more there, you will see that the Cactaceae is extremely diverse in Baja California. And it is really that kind of richness of species in that family is you don't find in many parts of the world, but there is one where in that region, it is a dominant plant family. And it's not just the Cactaceae that's interesting. I know most of the group here are cactus and succulent lovers. We have about 300 different succulent plant taxa, depending on how you define succulents, in 27 different plant families on the peninsula and its islands. Of course, the Cactaceae is the most dominant, but also you have the Crassulaceae, especially the genus Dudleya. You have agaves of all sorts and very high endemism there as well. In agaves, I think 90% of all the species in the Agavaceae are endemic to the peninsula. But all of the cacti there, over 70% are unique to the peninsula, endemic. And there are multiple succulent genera. You may not recognize all of these, but these are succulents. Like Baryopsis is a composite in the Asteraceae that's endemic to Guadalupe Island. Cochimea, as Peter will tell you, actually everything's going to be changing to Cochimea, pretty much, not everything, but a lot of the species will be. But in the strict sense, it is those hummingbird type pollinated species that were thought to be unique to the peninsula, and now we're finding that's not the case. Culturella is another composite in the Asteraceae. That is one species of it. Morangaea, depending on if you consider that in Echinocereus or not, is a cactus group in the Cape region. And Pachycormus, which is the Baja California elephant tree in the Anacardiaceae. So different than all the rest, it's one of our elephant trees, but it is different from all the rest of the Bursaras that are in a completely different non-related family. So we've had a couple of convergence in looking at elephant tree form, so Pachycormus and Bursaraceae. So let's take a step back about the cactus family in general, and I think you guys pretty much know this, but the group is basically an American group, North, South, and Central America. There's still a lot of debate on exactly how many species, about 111 genera, 1,500 species, more or less. But there are historically, the group has had, as far as taxonomy is concerned, has had a lot of people invested and interested in it. And I think there's over 12,000 binomials for cactus species. People naming, this one has 3 spines and this one has 2 spines. And maybe they were not as evolutionarily significant as they could have been in early naming times. But one species, Rhipsalis bicifera, seems to have naturally got outside of the Americas and moved to Africa, Madagascar, and Sri Lanka. You can see a little bit about all that. Cacti in general, woody stem succulents have CAM photosynthesis. They're pretty much all of the members in general, we don't recognize sepals and petals, but we call everything tepals because it's a gradation. there are a lot of questions on the phylogenetic relationships within the family in the area. So I just wanted to show this just to give you an idea of the one member that basically got out on its own. And one of the things that helped with us understanding that is looking at the chromosomes and polyploidy. So polyploidization is when you take an entire genome and double it, and then you can double it even further and increase that as you go up in full sets of chromosomes rather than just chromosome number. And in plants can do all kinds of things when it comes to cytogenetics and their chromosome behavior. Many plants have like aneuploid series where they just add or lose one chromosome. And of course, in animals, that is not very well. If you think of like trisomy 21, it has a pretty detrimental effect on the organism when you just mess up with one chromosome. In plants, this is more of a common thing. In cacti, we don't see as much aneuploidy, we see polyploidy. But for this particular species, you can see that it basically started out as a diploid in South America, went to a tetraploid in Mexico, Central America. And then we saw basically going from tetraploid and octoploid and on as it went to Africa, Madagascar, and Sri Lanka. And that kind of shows directionality. It's very hard to cut that in half. It's much easier to increase sets of chromosomes than the reverse. And so that's kind of how we can unravel the directions of that throughout the world. Now, the Cactaceae are, of course, part of the Caryophyllales, which used to be called the Centrospermi. And if you really take a chemotaxonomy, basically elucidated the group pretty early looking at betalain chemistry. So all the rest of the higher flowering plants have anthocyanins, but this one group basically has betalains. But if you look at things like floral structure, it's really hard to put the Cactaceae because they're a little bit different and highly derived. But then you can see there what the closest ones that we consider right now: Cactaceae, Portulaceae, Didieraceae, and the Basilaceae. So those would be kind of coordinated within that higher Caryophyllales. Now, let's back up and look at diversity of cacti in the region. So North America, 9 species. California, we're not overly diverse in the group. We have about 35. I would say Arizona, Texas, et cetera, probably exceed that. San Diego County, we have most of them for California down here, almost 30 of that. But Baja California, it is quite a force to be reckoned with as far as species diversity. And you have 106, but we'll just take that to 131 because sometimes there's a lot of debate. Should we recognize this as a variety or subspecies or lift it up to species? So I'll kind of talk in that taxa in general, which would include those varieties and subspecies. So about 131. And of those, there amazing diversity in various ways when you look at the Cactaceae. So I said that over 70% endemism. You have Mammillaria, Cylindropuntia, and Opuntia as your most rich groups with the most species in those genera throughout the peninsula and adjacent islands. But when I show this picture, if you know anything about basically coevolution and pollination biology, all of peninsula are doing that a little bit differently. And so on the left, you see a Cochimea, which is that kind of red tubular form, which is hummingbird pollinated. On the top is a cardone flower, which is using bats for pollination. On the right, the upper right, is a typical cactus flower, kind of a general flower that's now using honeybees, but there's a whole group of bees, the cactus bees, that come in and use those throughout various species that have open flower. Then the lower right is Stenocereus scamosus, and that you can see the long tube on that. It's hawk moth pollinated. So these moths that are crepuscular come out at dusk and dawn. They can unroll their proboscis and go all the way down to the bottom of that tube to get the nectar in there. So it's way too long. They open at night, but it's way too long for any bats to actually get into that. And then the Myrtillocactus cochal on the bottom, it opens at night. It's very fragrant, sweet, and attracts various types of moths to come in for pollination. So you can look at that diversity as not just pure numbers, but you can look at it like from a pollination syndrome standpoint, or you can look at it from like a growth habit variability. So as many of you know, cacti like the cardone is basically a tree. That one is about, on the left there, Cactaceae springlii is about 70 feet high, and they form forests on the peninsula. And really, I don't know if you can see my pointer as I'm doing it, but you can see it's really a dense forest. Think about how much water and other things that are locked in those cacti above ground, even in areas where we don't get very much rainfall. We have the Stenocereus aruca, the creeping devil, which grows flat along the ground on the Magdalena Plains and lays down adventitious roots as it goes along, and then it kind of moves across this sandy plain, which is kind of a unique growth form within Cactaceae. We have no true epiphytes of cacti have species that think they are, like the prickly pear in the crotch of a boojum tree or Sirio here. You see that because they can live on very little soil. Then we have like mammillarias, quite a few mammillarias that their mature forms they're almost geophytic. Most of their body is underneath the ground. They come out to flower. The flowers can be larger and showier than the actual plant itself. And then over to the right, you see snails on there. Obviously, it's a little more of a tropical area, and this is in the Cape region. Not only is it that cactus, but if you look to the right, there's Preskyopsis that has the big leaves there in the Opuntioides. So that's another cacti forms in these regions. It's a wonderful group, lots of barrels of sorts. And I just took this one on expedition a couple of years ago. I am not a short person, I will just tell you. I'm about almost 6'3". You can see how tall on Catalina Island the barrels can get. They're really amazing, and they kind of make the cardones look like dwarfs out there. Echinocereus is quite rich. Echinocereus sciurus here and Maritimus below. Morangea hanging off the rock areas and cliffs in the Cape region. Of course, we have a few Griersonia or Perinopuntia, and then lots of mammillarias throughout the entire region. Now, how important are they for in Baja California? Well, some of us, it's almost a religious importance, but they are important still from many aspects and as far as people are concerned. So you still see Pitaya agria and Pitaya dulce, which is two Stenocereus species, Stenocereus squamosus and thurberi, harvested. The pitayas are harvested and eaten, and you can buy them along the road in the Cape region of the southern state as well. Various Opuntia lagunae, some are used for fruits still, and some are actually used for nopalitos, but most of the stuff now, we have Opuntia ficus indica that is fields of it in different areas. So they're not harvesting as much the wild Opuntias as stuff, the basically cultivated species of the mission prickly pear. As far as people that are enthusiasts, there's all kinds of weird crests and fasciations that occur of the cacti here. Just starting to the left, there's Stenocereus gummosus doing this weird spiral. Of course, cardones can do crests. The totem pole cactus, there's two different forms, actually three different forms in many people consider, but its natural occurrences in central Baja, and that's Lophocereus shaddii, variety monstrosus there in the field. You go down to the bottom, there's Bergerol cacti with crests, there's giant barrels like this Pherocactus rectispinus. Choyas can do it and try to act like prickly pears. That's Cylindropuntia ganderi variety catavenensis. And of course, mammillarias can do this. All these are just common crests and abnormalities of plants that are often sought after by collectors and things worldwide. But really, their most important in Baja California is their ecological importance. And we have such a diversity, not just a diversity, it's also a dominance in many of our areas. So you see areas that, I don't know if you know this, but the southern state is just got, well, and the northern state in many areas have choyas. So these huge numbers of species of choyas and individuals of choyas forming populations. In fact, for the people of Baja California Sur, the southern state, are called choyeros. which means they basically, these are people who live among the choyas, or they're named for having so many different species and just a dominance of choyas in the area. They even have songs about choyeros and things. But the cardones form dominant landscapes as well. Like I said, these are like forests among parts of the peninsula. And you see the guy down here in the left, and if you've heard me talk before, that was a student when I was a student, and we went to Baja California, and he was studying the evolution of mites that are basically that take rides on fruit flies, but only certain species that feed on certain species of cacti. So it's quite the ecological web when you get start going down deeper and deeper, looking at what's happening, because you have to find a rotting cactus, and then you have to find the right species of fruit fly, and then you look for the mites that are actually taking rides on them. So really some interesting webs at that level as well. And then more recently, we've all known a little nectaries. There is still a lot of work that needs to be done in the Cactaceae. So these are examples of, if you look to the left here, these are gland spines. So this is an individual of beryl that actually is a full mutation with all the rest of the centrals and the radial spines converted to these nipple-like structures secreting sugars. And those are what we call gland spines, and they are a type of extrafloral nectary. And the importance of this, I think, is pretty severely underestimated yet, because there are a lot of species, especially ants, but other insects that use these. And it's obviously important because we've seen it come up, all these extrafloral nectaries in different ways throughout the Cactaceae, throughout the Americas. Of choyas doing it, but here you can see on the outside parts of the bracts here of the tepals on that's Stenoceros squamosus. There's an ant almost on every single one. And so why would they do this? Why would they go to such effort to give their sugars away? So just a few years ago, Mosseth and myself and others started trying to classify the extrafloral nectaries. And you can see all of these different types. One that's still kind of a mystery, and this is the one that first keyed me into it, is Lophoceros schottii. And you can see this drop of sugar outside of the areole. And a lot of the other ones, like, we understand how spines can convert, et cetera, but how does this thing get outside developmentally? And it still hasn't been studied to this point. So is it some evolutionary vascular trace? What's causing that to happen in that group? But it is happening in multiple ways in different groups. Prickly pears do it. Here's a species from Magdalena Island, Opuntia pycnantha. And if you look in the bottom left, you can see the ants here, but notice this like popsicle light colored spine with little droplets on it, and that's what they're feeding on. So there's lots of different ways these extrafloral nectaries can function. Or a really restricted species, Lophoceros gatesii, you can see they also have, like the other Lophoceros species, they have their extrafloral nectary outside of the areole. Now, the peninsula provides some interesting opportunities as well. So if you think of like where plants come from historically, we have this massive thing here in California that goes up to Oregon, that goes into northwestern Baja, called the California Floristic Province. And it is a biodiversity hotspot, not only from the species that are there, but of course, the risk that is there, the endemism that's there, et cetera. But then you think of, well, cacti being in the Sonoran Desert is of like Arizona, but the rest of Baja, except for the Cape, is also Sonoran Desert. It's modified Sonoran Desert down the region. So like if you look at the left here in the area of El Rosario, you get opportunities of having the California Floristic Province actually come in and touch the Sonoran Desert. These species normally are completely separated by higher elevation, like in Southern California, but here they come together, and that provides opportunities. Like if you look in the lower right here, there's Burghrocactus emerii, which is a California Floristic Province species, and you have the cardone, which is a Sonoran Desert species. Well, those opportunities can actually yield things. So where I'm talking about on the peninsula is right here. You can see this is the top parts here in the northwestern part of the peninsula is coastal sage scrub, chaparral, high elevation oak woodland, oak conifer woodland. And then this is the coastal succulent scrub, of Baja, and then else is Sonoran Desert except for the Cape. And you have a huge diversity of things that are restricted to all of these, but the area of overlap is right in this region between the central desert, which is that kind of yellowish color, and then the kind of brownish there of this coastal succulent scrub. And you get Burgero like this species going right next to the Cardone, which dominates in the Sonoran Desert. Further down, you can see those amazing landscapes of various succulents in areas of the central desert, like Cataviña and the region. The Cardone being a dominant part of the rest of the peninsula, representing the Sonoran Desert. And they actually can hybridize in those mosaic areas, those overlaps between the California floristic province and the Sonoran Desert. I always say it's like a Great Dane and a Chihuahua coming together, but you can see the right is an intergeneric hybrid between those two things. And rare, but it does happen naturally in this area. But then you throw into the mix Myrtillocactus as well, and you have Burgerocactus, and they can grow side by side. And on the right, you have another intergeneric hybrid that occurs in this region, which is Myrtillocactus lindsayii. So that sort of overlap of these big floristic provinces can allow opportunities for kind of unique things to develop. Now, on top of that, we've learned a lot about basically reproductive biology in cacti, and we're learning more all the time. We are far from done in this. We used to think that all cacti basically had, they had bisexual flowers. Boy, were we wrong in that. That has changed immensely over the years. And examples are like this Echinocereus mombergerianus, or you can put it under Pacificus if you would like, at the top, high elevation of the San Pedro Martyr. So this occurs about 8,500 feet and above. To our high peak is over 10,000 feet in this area, growing with aspen and the like. And it's one of the claret cup group. But basically, it appears that it's a trioecious species, so 3 sexual conditions. And now each individual is one condition or another. So you have, if you look at the lower left, that's a bisexual flower. You have viable pollen, it appears, and a viable stigma. Whereas all the flowers on another individual, you can see it doesn't produce any pollen, it has more stigmatic lobes, and it is a female. And then we find others in the population that appear to be only male with abortive pistils. Now, this still needs to be researched. This is something I've noticed in the field, and that's based on morphology, that's what we would predict is happening, but nobody's really done the work on the reproductive biology of that. The Cardone itself was found many years ago now to be trioecious as well. 3 different sexual states, or you could actually say there's a small percentage that were neuter, so you almost have 4 sexual states if you throw that in there. And we thought a lot of that might be connected with bat pollination. That is not what we're finding now, and not sure what's driving that. But I'll talk about the importance of dioecious and trioecious and gynodioecious as far as an evolutionary concept in just a little bit. Now, the one species that was named Mammillaria dioica, naming that it is dioecious, really isn't dioecious, meaning separate male and female plants. It's gynodioecious. It actually has separation of the flowers look different. The bisexual individuals have larger tepals, much larger, versus the females have much smaller tepals. But the female flowers and individuals produce more seeds than the ones that are bisexual. So a whole plant is like that. So that's what we call gynodioecious, females and bisexual individuals in the population. And there are some cacti that have been found androdioecious as well, so where you have males and bisexual individuals in there. But here's a species I named a few years ago, and I thought it would be gynodioecious because it appears, if you look at the flowers here, this is Cylindropuntia sanfilippensis. If you look, I was showing flower color variation, but if you look closer, this individual here and this individual are not producing any pollen. You can see the yellow pollen stuff here. So we found out that, oh, maybe there's something going on. These may be females and these may be bisexual. And that's what we would say based on just straight morphology. It's probably gynodioecious. But we found recently, we found this same thing in Cylindropuntia wolfii. So before, like my work on choyas on Baja, we had no idea. We thought all choyas basically had bisexual flowers. And now we're finding, look at the variation, but you see there are individuals here of wolfii doing that same thing. Well, I don't have time to take it any further. I'm a taxonomist, but I got some people interested at San Diego State, and there's been a couple of graduate students now working on this and have found that it is absolutely not gynodioecious as the morphology or the way the flowers look are. It is actually completely functionally dioecious. So there is abortion basically of the male and female parts. So you have male individuals and female individuals in the population. Even though it looks like you have a bisexual flower, it is not. Those are males, and the other ones are females. And they had to follow that developmentally. So they had to watch pollen and watch development of the flowers and cross-sectioning them to see what's happening through the whole development. Time and effort to do that kind of thing. And so those are things we had no idea. And so we're constantly learning from the group. So if you think about cactus taxonomy, we know, like I said earlier, 1,800 species, 4 to 5 subfamilies. We know like the Opuntioidy is a monophyletic group, phylogenetically speaking, so it is one lineage. But then when you look at Opuntia and Cylindropuntia, not so clear. It is not showing that it is monophyletic taxonomy and names down the road once this is figured out. We know it right now, but we haven't taken that next step as far as separating it. Let's go back to diversity in the region of Opuntioids. So I'm just going to focus on choyas here and look at like Opuntioid diversity in California versus Baja. Baja's off the charts in respect to choyas, so Cylindropuntia. I think that is a low number now. Different kinds of choyas. That was my entire dissertation work, because it is such an area of high diversity. And Opuntia, I put 16 there, but to be honest, I've been working on that group quite a bit over the years, although I've gotten distracted with other parts of the flora, and that group might kill me. It is not an easy group taxonomically, and there's definitely going to be multiple new species coming out of it, but I do not have a good grasp of that genus yet on the peninsula. And I've had students in the Cape region working on new taxa, naming things from the Cape region, but we still have a lot of work to do. Choya is really an amazing group, as you know. That I know Petra was talking about leaves and spines that light up when they're backlit. There's Cylindropuntia alcahes. Who got me involved in that was my major advisor, Dr. Donald Pinkava, really an amazing man. He's no longer alive with us, but he taught me basically how to study this group and many others working on Opuntia as well. And as many of you know, they're fun in the field. Both prickly pears and choyas have what's called thigmotropic stamens, where they're like this upper shot. And as soon as you touch them, all the stamens converge and move on that to basically put more pollen onto the pollinators as they come visit the flowers. But it's a fun parlor trick when you're out in the field, and kids love it as well, because it's like a sea anemone going over your finger. I mentioned this about Opuntia. I'm not going to go into this, but this is something I've been working on. We have cylindrical prickly pears on the peninsula. They are really plastic, many of the species, as far as spination and the shapes of the pad and the fruits, but trying to make sense of what we can in respect to the group. I have some that are very clear, like Opuntia lagunae in the top. It's quite isolated from the rest in the higher elevations of the Cape region in the Sierra de la Laguna. I've named a few, Opuntia clarkiorum, named after the people that endowed my position to get me to the museum many years ago. It's a beautiful species. It is these big, round, shiny pads. It actually has colored spines, bands of colors up and down the spines of it. And it is really quite restricted in that area. And I've named a few cacti. This publication, I think I got 7 new cacti out, including some pretty unique rare things. This is Cylindropuntia libertadensis, and it's only known from that one little dot in the middle of the peninsula right here, if you can see my pointer. But it needs a lot more work. I'm sure maybe it's of hybrid origin, but what it's a hybrid with, I'm not exactly sure. Other things like Grissonias or Corinnopuntias. This is Grissonia or Corinnopuntia robertsii, named after Norm Roberts, who wrote the plant field guide with me and really was an all-around good guy before he passed away. And there's some new work I'm not going to say much about, but Michelle is on here, and Mark Baker and Lucas Major have found some real interesting things on hybridization. And just to go back, I show this picture because when I described that species, I thought, well, maybe this is a hybrid between a cholla and a club cholla, but there are none of those known. So I'll leave it at that because I'm not going to bust any bubbles on that. But now with some new evidence in molecular, we might have some new information for you on that group. And of course, we also have Preskyopsis on the peninsula in the Cape region, Preskyopsis porteri. There was another one called Gatesii, which is not a good taxon. But it was actually a cholla and a Preskyopsis together. It was the two things on the type. But this one is not uncommon in the Cape region. And now let's focus just on the biosystematics, or this whole idea of what's happening with evolutionary processes in Cylindropuntia cedrosensis, because cactus taxonomy, especially in chollas, has challenges involved here. You have to spend a lot of time in the field, but this one I put here specifically. I described this species, but I have never ever seen it in flower. And that is, it occurs on islands that are hard to get to. You can see I got it in bud once, but I can't even tell what the flower color. That was the oldest bud that I could find, but it has an extremely unique fruit type as well for the genus. And so it was really easy to describe because it is so different from any of the other chollas on the peninsula. It has this kind of depressed fruit that's kind of spiny, but yet fleshy on the same side. So chollas are really a pretty cool group. I know it's probably underappreciated by many enthusiasts out there, but they're beautiful in many ways. They have a range of flower color. Most people think of them like this picture that came from Norm Roberts' book, the original molesta jumping cholla on someone's forehead, but at least, but it is, so that is part of things you find in the group, these jumping chollas, which really don't jump, but I'll talk about that as well. Others like Gander's cholla, beautiful species. They could really be used in cultivation because they have kind of this erect growth habit and a lot of flowers when they produce flowers. You've got things like those typical chollas, and then you have these tiny thin ones, these penciled chollas. In this case, this is the diamond cholla, Cylindropuntia ramosissima. It's called the diamond cholla because you can see the tubercles have this diamond look kind of separation or tubercle on them. And another interesting group of low hot desert up to Mojave, but also in the Sonoran Desert and in northeastern Baja. Now, chollas have a range of different types of fruits, and you can have like bristly, dry fruits to the common fruits here that are dry and spiny. And we used to think that, oh, there's a big separation between dry and spiny fruits and fleshy and naked fruits. Maybe not so much anymore. Definitely on the peninsula, we find things that are fleshy but have spines, and we have a few dry ones that lack any spines as well, like Cylindropuntia tasajo, but they're maybe using those fruits not just like you would think for dispersal of seeds. Like if you look here at the bottom, that's a picture of Cylindropuntia lindsay, which is a species I described, which is near Leptocolis, but notice the stem joints coming out of the fruit. And so the fruit is basically in that way. It may or may not have seeds in it, but you touch that, all those little stems fall off and you get this way of propagating asexually from the fruit itself. And the challenges of chollas can be highly variable, like most cacti. And this is the problem when we start saying, well, this one is erect and this one is growing flat to the ground. The snake cholla is a good example of that. In many parts of coastal sage scrub here in Southern California, it grows flat along the ground, hence the name snake cholla. But then many individuals and populations, they're completely erect, growing as well. So it got that name, but it is not all of them are representative of that name. That's kind of growth habit variability. Of course, spines do not hold in most areas. They are very plastic and they respond to the environment. This is all the same species. This is Cylindropuntia choya, very spiny near like windy areas along the Pacific coast. You can see a few more spines here until it starts losing spines, more inland things, completely spineless. And it's not just the number of spines, it also can impact things like the extrafloral nectaries. So here's the top of Cylindropuntia choya. These little tiny nipple structures are just like what you see in barrel cacti. They have gland spines, and ants come in and use them as well. And so that number of those can change from place to place and may have really important ecosystem impacts on the species that are there or using those extrafloral nectaries. Spine color, oh boy, does that range all over. Like this is just one species, Cylindropuntia ganderi variety catavenensis. It comes in white, basically, or almost a silver. You can get it in yellow. You can get it in kind of this maroon reddish color as well. And these are all throughout the populations of that in the field. And so that doesn't really bother us. We understand that those are not different species. Those are just part of the variation of that species within a population. And that goes the same for flower variability. When I look at this, I'm trying to document all the different types of flowers that are there. And then I told you in Wolfii, we found there were some things going on with reproductive biology, but that's just a range of variation in size of flower and in color themselves. Oops, let me go, I think it's gonna move. Let me go back one. There's a little bit of a delay here. Cactus documentation. I think one of our biggest limitations for understanding the species has been the historic collections of cacti. If you look at the one to the left, it's just a sterile piece of a cactus. We have no idea, that was from the 60s, no flowers, no fruits, it's a piece of stem, know nothing about what the plant looked like, etc. Whereas what we try to do these days, now we're doing everything at high resolution as far as digitizing these specimens. So you get these photos that will stay with the digital images into the future, but get flowers and fruits and seeds so that we have better understanding of these cacti and their variation in the field. And it takes a long time to develop those types of historic references to better understand the variability. And we use that from things in the field, from the herbarium. I've used SEM, scanning electron microscopy, historically, looking at pollen, looking at seeds, but when you look at seeds of opuntioids, at least these, you're not actually looking at the seed coat, you're looking at the aril over the top. The seed coat's on the inside, you'd have to peel that off to look for any characters, and micromorphology of spines and that kind of stuff. We looked at pollen in general, looking at the exine, looking at how, if there are any species delimitations in the pollen. And basically what we found out is there's not, very little. There are all these spherical polyporate grains. But I had a student in Mexico when I was living down there in a Fulbright who was looking at pollen grains, master's work, and she looked at all these different species of choyas, and we did find there is a pollen grain size, but it's not really an unexpected thing. Higher polyploids, like things that are hexaploids, 6 sets of genomes, or octoploids, 8 sets of genomes, had larger pollen grains than diploids and triploids. So that at least we were able to tell, but outside of that, there really wasn't a difference on any micro characters of the pollen and things like that. We found some interesting aberrations and variation. You find a lot of collapsed pollen grains, and I'll talk about why that's important in understanding the species, but found some things that are really bizarre, and seeing aberrant styles and stigmas coming out of an ovule inside of there. So that is obviously not going to be a good evolutionary trick, because it's never going to get pollinated inside of the ovule of an inferior ovary of the flower. But the variation is there nonetheless. And one of the kind of coolest ones that I found, and this is one of my first publications on aberrations, was Cylindropuntia prolifera. So this is a common coast choy we have here in Southern California and Northwestern Baja. And if you take a closer look at the flower, so the upper right, they see these little structures coming off of the top of an anther. And what that is, and here this one shows a lot of them coming on the outer whorls here. What that is off of a male structure, the anther that's producing pollen, comes a female structure. That's an aberrant style and stigma with stigmatic papillae. You can see on SEM here. Now, that should never happen ever in the world. That should have been like pulled out. This is a triploid species. We don't know why it is doing it, but you find it throughout the range of the species, but it's a weird aberration. I always say, well, it could be the next step in the evolution of cactus flowers. Let's say the big pollinators that go to the central stigma may no longer visit there. And little things come in and want to get pollen and get some nectar. They come to the outside world, they could touch that. Pollen technically could actually grow through the stigma, through the style, down through the connective and the filament to reach an inferior ovary where the ovules are. Now, is that happening? Probably not, but it is a possibility into the future for this species, and it might be selected for. Hybridization is a big deal in many of these groups of opuntioids. And that, when you couple it with polyploidy, that increasing in things, and you have perennial species that can use asexual reproduction to spread and maintain, you get some really interesting things. So historically, we have used, intermediacy, something that has an intermediate flower color, intermediate stem type, or spination, or whatever it may be, between the parents, and say, okay, well, hybrid. All of those tricks kind of blur the lines. It's hard to tell what is a good species. Where do the boundaries stop between these when hybridization and these other things get involved? So hybrids, you can think of, can be really rare. It can be rare, sterile, and that you get one individual and that's done. Or they can be quite common. They can be self-fertile. They can back cross to a parent taxon. They can take what we call gene introgression. They can take a few genes from this parent to this parent over here, or have something just completely unique in its own way. And so think of choyas that are jumping choyas. They may come out of this weird hybrid thing, and it'll go asexual and just spread through an entire area. And we think we're seeing that with things like Cylindropuntia prolifera. So just to give you an idea of how common hybridization is in these choyas, I say they're a promiscuous group. They like to fool around with other sympatric species or things that are growing around them. This is upper left is the three good species are along the top. So Cylindropuntia delgadiana, Cylindropuntia tasajo, they hybridize to form this. Tasajo times ganderi hybridize to form this. But you have to kind of look for these. These are not common in the field. They are more rare, what we say F1 hybrids. Then you get things that are a little more tricky. And you get like Cylindropuntia prolifera. I told you how unique it is with this weird stamen aberration. It's also a triploid species. It really does not go through sexual reproduction very well. Go over some things that Cylindropuntia choya, a Baja Californian Sonoran desert species, and Cylindropuntia acajas, another Baja California Sonoran desert species, probably hybridized in an area like El Rosario where these things came together. And the hybrid found its unique niche in the Mediterranean climate in the California Floresic province. And it is spread asexually from there and has done very well, where both parents did not. So for whatever reason, that unique gene combination gave them the ability and that hybrid event to become a good ecological species. And that species is fascinating from multiple things. It's called prolifera because it goes fruit to fruit to fruit, proliferating fruit. Those fruits are not just sexual. In fact, they are pretty much not sexual in this, but they can fall apart, drop to the ground, and form new clonal individuals. And so they are asexual propagules in this. And choyas are fascinating from that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit because they can pull lots of tricks and when it comes to those things. So you could have good seeds in one of those, and you could be asexual and sexual at the same time and form different individuals from those fruits. Mark Baker did some great work on Cylindropuntia calvinensis, the hybrid between Fulgida and Spinosaur in southern Arizona, looking at how that is working. It's a long and looking at the chromosomes involved in that as well. More locally in San Diego, we have what's called the Mason Valley cholla. It's a really rare cholla called Silvapuntia fosbergii, and it grows with Ganderi and Biglovii in Anza-Borrego desert area. We thought, okay, well, maybe it's some weird hybrid between those, except really kind of unique looking. If you look in the back, there's actually Biglovii here. There's another Biglovii, but the tallest individual are these fosbergii in this. They have a little different color to them. They're really good at asexual. They drop all their joints and they can form new individuals. And of course, Biglovii does that as well. It's also, well, diploid in some populations at the extremes, but it's often a triploid species, and it reproduces asexually as well. And so we knew that it really resembles Biglovii in many ways. And probably it has multiple genomes that are shared with Biglovii. We're like, okay, we can test this and see, here's the distribution in our county. That's it. It's only along this area, and it's quite common in that region of San Diego County in the desert, but it is rare as you think about distribution because it's only. Mike Mayer at University of San Diego looked at AFLPs, molecular data, to look at banding of these species and try to look at other things that grow in the area and find out, okay, can we find the other parent? We're pretty sure Biglovii is one of those, but what's the other parent? We couldn't find it. Not at all, actually. And then if you look at like how many unique loci, unique bands it had, it didn't act just like a hybrid, like unique things as well that were completely outside of Biglovii. So right now we've removed we don't know what it's a hybrid of. So it is a rare, definitely asexual species in the area, but it is really interesting, and it may be a hybrid that's just maintaining and spreading asexually, and we just don't know what the other parent, and maybe the other parent's gone. We don't know that as well. There's other techniques that we've used over time, of course, morphological studies, chromosome counts, lactophenol stains. So I'm going to go into what those are. So we'll take right off our herbarium sheets, we can look at pollen, and you can do this aniline blue lactophenol stain to see, was that pollen grain ever alive? And it doesn't mean, we consider it like a viability thing, but it doesn't mean that it had to be viable at that point. But it is a way of estimating how much good pollen something is producing. And then, we found in Baja, most of them are good except for those triploids. It is hard to take 3 sets and divide it equally into 4 different things at the end. And so most triploids really don't do meiosis very well. And we know that chromosomes have a base number of 11, the base number is 11. Hybridization, we've looking at variation in the various behavioral things. And I'm going to just show you a few of those right now. Polyploidy is very important in the Cactaceae. Pinkava looked at all the cacti that have been counted thus far, and almost 30% of cacti are polyploid. That's the entire family. But look in some groups like the Opuntioideae, it is much more important. Almost 65% of all of the Opuntioids are that. Or chollas, it's even higher than that as well, or less than that, but it's almost 46%. And ranging from triploid to octoploid as far as polyploids are concerned within the cholla group. And so we look at behavior of those and count the numbers of chromosomes. And like I said, this is a lot of my work from way back when, so I'm not doing it as much anymore. I still do a count now and then, but it has been a real important source of knowledge for us in understanding the evolution of these groups. And yes, we know that we didn't have any aneuploid stuff going on really. It's mostly full sets of chromosomes. Triploidy is really common. And when it is, you see some impacts of that as far as at the end of meiosis, you get what's called polyads. Normally, you should get, at the end of meiosis, 4 equal things that have halved the chromosome number of whatever your parent was. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4. They should all be equal in size. When you have basically disjunction problems like chromosomes not knowing what to do and where to go, you get micropollen, you get macropollen. those can all, that carry different numbers. They'll form pollen grains, but they carry different numbers of chromosomes along with them. And to understand how easy it is to get to polyploidy, here's an example. I actually caught nuclei. So instead of dividing at the end of meiosis into 4, it only divided to 2. And that means that each one of these pollen grains has double the number of chromosomes than it should. And so if that pollen grain makes it to the egg and fertilizes, you automatically have a polyploid based on the chromosomes that are there. And it is very common in our region. We know that some of these polyploids are just themselves doubling. So like prolifera is normally a triploid. We found it can double to 66. So 33 to 66. Or Slender-Puntia choya is mostly diploids in there that you've gone from 22 to 44. Others examples are probably from hybrids coming in, what we call allopolyploids. So one species contributes so many genomes and another one contributes so many. That's what an allopolyploid occurs. And we've tried to count these things, Pinkava, Baker, myself, various people over the years, just to get a better assessment of what the chromosome numbers are throughout the field of many of these species. And I don't expect you to read that, just put that in there. Sometimes we're not always correct. So Slender-Puntia californica, the snake choya, and like Slender-Puntia delgadilloana here, named after Jose Delgadillo to the left there. And when I was looking at this in Baja, I found, okay, these look like they're all varieties. You can find a few intermediates between all of these varieties. They're all diploid, et cetera. Now we're finding with molecular that, whoa, delgadilloana doesn't seem like it's that closely related to snake choya. And maybe even the higher elevation thing, which we called Bar Parkeri, they've just now lifted, whoa, it's different enough, we should call it Bernardina at a species level. And so maybe we weren't correct in understanding that. And molecular gives us another viewpoint at looking more data to look at these types of things and better understand them. And I want to add, because I threw some distribution, I want to tell you like what iNaturalist is doing for us as far as cacti. It is changing our knowledge of distribution of these things. So here's an example of Baja California. We had, just 50-some collections of like a barrel cactus over in Anza-Borrego, and that gives us a pretty good idea. Then get to iNaturalist and people adding these, and I verify things online, and it gives us a whole different amount of knowledge as far as where they occur. People go down a trail or up a canyon, they're taking pictures of every single barrel cactus, and we're getting all this data to better understand distribution of the species, model them into the future with climate change, with all these other things. So this has really changed our knowledge of distribution of species of cacti. So that's a large succulent, but what about small thing? No different. There's over, I think we have, I can't read that on my screen, but maybe 60 different collections of Mammillaria dioica in the herbarium, over 2,000 observations. So really giving us more pinpointed data. And then this one is crazy. I think we have 8 specimens of this, but there are over 4,600 observations on iNaturalist. Like, what the hell are they doing? Well, they're actually mapping the population with iNaturalist, taking pictures of every single individual of this rare choya. And that can be studied and gone back to in 10, 20 years, 50 years, whatever, and see how the population has changed. And actually see what the individuals at those points look like and how they have changed. So it's just a different technique of using photography and the like. So let me go back to polyploidy. So polyploidy, as I said, is we have these high octoploids, things like molesta and molesta clavellina and Camaliana as well. But one thing we found in Cactaceae, all of these things where I was saying there's weird things, dioici and dioici, or at least functional dioici, are in polyploids. And that means you have multiple sets of chromosomes, and it might give you the ability to play around a little bit and still keep status quo. So you might be able to, not like a detrimental mutation may help you become towards one sex or another, but you can still maintain all of your metabolic activities and things from another sex. So we're finding in cacti, they're pretty much all above diploid, where you see something going on as far as dioecious or gynodioecious, and often much higher than that, hexaploids and octoploids as well. So the last thing I'm going to talk about very quickly is these reproductive strategies. So, you know, opuntioids have evolved pretty rapidly, and they use a lot of different, a combination of reproductive strategies. So I'm going to go through these and just very quickly tell you what I mean by this. So the first one being sexual reproduction. Of course, they need this for gene exchange. So you have to have genetic variability in these populations in one way or another, or they're doomed with any change that is down there. And one way to do that is this dioecious and gynodioecious. Separate your sexes on your individuals. You know they have to have different genetics, and then they cross, and that outcrossing basically yields more genetic diversity in the populations over time. So that is a really important thing. So we see this now going on with Sanfilippensis, which is either gynodioecious or functionally dioecious, Wolffii, probably Chuckbolaensis as well. All these things that are doing this playing around with gynodioecious. But cloning, that whole asexual thing, is really important as well. They can use detached stems to get from one place to another, or they can form roots right out of the vegetative things. And sometimes your fruits and your seeds are also asexual. And so to look at that, so we've got multiple species where they use asexual propagation or vegetative propagation. Get near, but not just Cylindropuntias, some of the prickly pears do it. Opuntia fragilis, Opuntia pubescens, they fall apart when you touch them. Cylindropuntia lepticalis, Biglovii, you go to the teddy bear cholla, whole hillsides are probably one individual. And they just have rolled off and formed a new one and a new one. And this is what we mean by jumping chollas. They don't actually jump. The terminal segments or cladodes actually come off very easily with anything. A wind, if you just barely brush by it, they'll pop right off and they can form a new individual. And that is a common thing within the chollas in there. And some of the fleshy fruited ones are even more interesting. So here's Cylindropuntia libertarensis. And I told you I just named that a few years ago. It's here on the left. For the longest time, I thought it was this, Cylindropuntia cholla, but it's not. It's quite different looking from that. But look here in the lower left. You see this fruit that is a fleshy fruit? And you say, well, there could be seeds in there. Well, that's true. It could have sexual seeds in there. But what it's doing here is from that fleshy stem, it's formed a new individual. So this is asexual. This is vegetative, because on the outside of the fruits of cacti, that is stem material. And it can produce, so that's undifferentiated tissue. It can produce roots, it can produce stems, it can produce new flower and fruit. That's where prolifera gets its name, from proliferating fruit to fruit. And this is what you get. So a joint drops and then you get roots formed and you have a new individual coming out of it. Many of these species use that in that way. And of course, these jumping chollas, they have some really good techniques for grabbing on and moving from one place to another for dispersal. So you have all these retorse barbs on there. So look at that spine at a microscopic level. The point is in the lower right. It is like a fish hook all the way up and down those spines. And so it grabs onto its thing and it can move from one place to the next. Eventually it drops off and forms a new asexual individual in this case. But they also use these spines on the dry fruited, spiny fruited chollas, because they have packets of seeds. They have spiny, dry packet that they're in, that grabs on, it can move those seeds to a whole new place as well. So that kind of spination is really important for dispersal in general. Now, the other type that we haven't actually proven in chollas, but we've seen it in prickly pears, is what's called adventive embryony. So you have inside of the female, basically, you have these nucellar cells, and they can pop a vegetative mother cell into the embryo sac, and you can only look at this through development, and form a clonal embryo. So you get a seed that's formed, but that seed is asexual. So you can disperse it, you could eat it, you could have a bird eat it and move it from one place to the next, but when it germinates, it's actually a clone of the mother that it came from. So not all seeds are sexual, and that is, I'm pretty sure it's happening in chollas where we have lots of fruits and you'll find one seed in there. Probably not going to be a sexual one, probably is having other problems, and that is an asexual seed that is formed there. Now, polyploidization, allowing for the DNA still to be there, you can get some genetic novelties, etc., because of these multiple copies of the genome themselves. And of course, we've seen that in choyas, although 66% of the choyas on Baja are diploid, there is a lot of these higher polyploids as well in the area. And the highest known is Cylindropuntia molesta, which relies on asexual, but probably forms good seeds. Well, it seems to as well, but it has systems that's a little bit different as well. And about is, of course, hybridization. And these are just, I've talked about the importance of these, but just to show you, not just in like the intergeneric hybrids like the Burgero cactus and the cardone, but these things can create things that are genetically separated from the parents, and then they can persist and they can spread. A good example of that is prolifera. And we think basically that's of hybrid origin. But you get to the area of El Rosario where the California Floristic Province and the Sonoran Desert meet, and it is a huge hybrid swarm. I cannot put names on most of the things, and it plays not just with those Cajes and Choya, molesta plays a role there. All these other things are coming in and playing a role. It's messy, and that may be an important thing for that species evolutionarily, because it's a transition area, and out of that may get these unique novelties that find success in either the California Floristic Province or desert. Hybrids can backcross and, like I said, introgress from one species to the next. So here's a great example of that. If you look at the thing on the left side of this, so what happens in this area is what I would say a mosaic of vegetation. So these two major provinces come together. On the north side, you have California Floristic Province, totally different species than what you have on the right side of this, the sunny side, that's Sonoran Desert. And so these species can get really close in that. And that's basically how we think that whole prolifera choya alcajes thing probably evolved. And with that, I'm going to call it. And I think we have some time for questions. Thank you so much for your attention.